The human brain is fundamentally a reward-based prediction machine. It learns by associating behaviors with outcomes. When you act in a certain way and receive a positive response, be it a smile, approval, praise, or inclusion, your brain encodes that behavior as valuable. Specifically, this process is governed by the dopaminergic system, which is responsible for driving motivation, habit formation, and reinforcement learning. When you're constantly being nice to everyone, especially in situations where it compromises your truth or boundaries, you are unknowingly training your brain to prioritize external validation over internal integrity. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. It's a pursuit chemical. It spikes not necessarily when you get the reward, but when your brain anticipates it. So every time you're overly agreeable or self-sacrificing in hopes of maintaining social harmony, avoiding rejection, or gaining approval, your brain links that action with a future reward. Over time, this creates a neural loop. Be nice, be accepted, be agreeable, be safe. This loop strengthens with repetition, wiring your behavior around appeasing others, not because you genuinely want to, but because your brain has been conditioned to think it's the safest and most rewarding path. From a neuroscience perspective, this behavior loop resembles an addiction. The hit of relief or approval you get after being overly accommodating lights up the same reward pathways that drugs or compulsive behaviors do. It's not just psychological, it's biological. Your nervous system is learning that sacrificing yourself for others is the fastest route to a feeling of safety, and safety is the brain's number one priority. But this is a short-term strategy that comes with long-term consequences. When you repeatedly seek approval through niceness, you begin to lose touch with your authentic identity. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive function and self-regulation, slowly shifts its priorities. Instead of helping you make decisions based on values, goals, or logic, it begins to focus on social calibration, asking, will this make them like me? Instead of, is this true to me? This compromises your decision-making abilities and can lead to chronic anxiety, indecisiveness, and a weakened sense of self. More importantly, this reward-seeking behavior erodes your capacity for discomfort. The brain, through neuroplasticity, adjusts to what you repeatedly do. If you train it to avoid conflict, say yes when you mean no, or stay silent when something is wrong, it will become less capable of handling discomfort and confrontation. These are essential emotional muscles. Just like physical muscles weaken when unused, the brain's circuits for self-protection, boundary enforcement, and honest communication weaken if neglected. You're not just becoming a nice person. You're becoming neurologically wired to suppress your truth. This suppression doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects how people perceive you. Humans are wired with mirror neurons that pick up on subtle cues like tone, facial tension, posture, and eye contact. When you're acting nice while internally stressed or resentful, those around you unconsciously detect the dissonance. It's not convincing. Your niceness feels hollow or suspicious. And over time, you become someone others take for granted, not because they're unkind, but because you've trained them just as you've trained yourself. And then there's the deeper cost. Your nervous system begins to equate authenticity with danger. Every time you override your real opinion or ignore your gut instinct in favor of pleasing someone else, your brain says, my truth per risk. Compliance to safety. That is a dangerous neurological association to build. It creates a loop where the more you betray yourself, the more comfortable your brain feels, because it's been rewarded for it. Meanwhile, speaking up, asserting yourself, or simply being honest starts to feel threatening, not because it is, but because the brain no longer associates it with a positive outcome. This is why people who are overly nice often feel drained, disrespected, or unseen. They're operating on a reward system that's rigged against their own well-being. It's not about being kind or generous. Those are powerful human traits. It's about compulsively being nice as a default response, and that response is not a virtue. It's a neurobehavioral adaptation to fear, rejection, or the need for approval. The good news is anything learned can be unlearned. But it starts with understanding that being nice isn't always noble. It can also be a maladaptive coping mechanism powered by a hijacked reward system. At the root of chronic niceness lies something much deeper than just good manners or kindness. It's not always a conscious choice to be agreeable, accommodating, or excessively pleasant. Often, it is a neurobiological stress response, a subtle but powerful mechanism driven by the brain's need for safety, not authenticity. Chronic niceness is frequently the result of the nervous system being locked in a pattern of appeasement, a lesser known survival strategy rooted in our evolutionary wiring. The human nervous system has several well-documented responses to perceived threat, fight, flight, freeze, and increasingly recognized by neuroscientists, fawn or appease. When a person constantly avoids conflict, always agrees to avoid friction, or suppresses their own needs to keep the peace, they are often engaging in the fawn response. This is not a rational strategic decision. It is a stress reflex governed by the autonomic nervous system, particularly the limbic structures such as the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which manage threat detection and stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. When the brain perceives social tension or disapproval as a threat, it activates this survival mechanism. For some people, especially those with early life experiences involving unpredictable caregivers or environments where expressing disagreement led to emotional withdrawal or punishment, the nervous system becomes hypersensitive to rejection. Their brain begins to equate disapproval with danger. The result is an automatic tendency to diffuse tension, soothe others, or self-silence, all in an effort to maintain connection, even at the cost of personal boundaries. This chronic state of appeasement keeps the body in a subtle, prolonged state of sympathetic arousal, what most people know as fight or flight mode. But instead of physically running or fighting, the person reacts with friendliness, passivity, and excessive politeness. On the outside, it may look like someone is just a good listener, always agreeable or nice to everyone. But internally, there is often a high level of physiological stress. The vagus nerve, which plays a key role in regulating calm and social engagement, may become dysregulated, leading to shallow breathing, tightness in the chest, and a sense of always walking on eggshells. This form of niceness is not compassion. It's self-protection masquerading as cooperation. It's a subconscious attempt to manage risk in a world where safety is defined not by personal truth, but by social harmony. Over time, this strategy becomes hardwired. The brain adapts to what it practices. If you've practiced appeasement for years, your nervous system will begin to favor it, even in situations where it's no longer appropriate or necessary. That's when chronic niceness becomes dangerous. You're no longer responding to real threats. You're reacting to perceived threats, often rooted in old emotional patterns and unprocessed stress. Furthermore, chronic niceness has biological consequences. It keeps cortisol levels slightly elevated, leading to fatigue, mood swings, lowered immunity, and even memory issues. Your brain and body begin to pay the price for constantly putting others' comfort ahead of your own clarity. The stress of never saying what you actually mean, of always scanning the environment for how to be most acceptable, becomes internalized. It's like running emotional antivirus software all day. It drains mental and physical resources. This also explains why chronically nice people often feel disconnected from themselves. If your nervous system is always scanning others to determine how you should act, you're never really acting from your own center. You're operating based on how others feel, what others want, what others need. This creates a fractured identity, one where self-trust is lost. Over time, the feedback loop gets stronger. The nicer you are, the safer you feel. The safer you feel, the more you suppress discomfort. And the more you suppress discomfort, the more you lose access to your real emotional signals, signals that are critical for self, respect boundary setting, and personal growth. Neuroscientifically, this chronic adaptation can shrink your window of tolerance, a concept in trauma and nervous system theory. The window of tolerance is the range in which your nervous system can function optimally, where you feel calm, connected, and in control. When you're always in fawn mode, your window narrows. You become reactive to small cues of disapproval, withdrawal, or criticism, which in turn pushes you deeper into automatic niceness. You're not choosing how to respond. You're being driven by survival circuitry that's overriding your conscious intent. Chronic niceness then isn't about being good. It's about being safe. And that's a critical distinction. Because once you realize that what looks like kindness may actually be fear wearing a smile, you can begin to question whether your actions are truly aligned with who you are, or just who you learn to be in order to avoid rejection, conflict, or abandonment. One of the most misunderstood emotions in modern culture is anger. From a neuroscience standpoint, anger is not inherently negative. In fact, it is a crucial adaptive signal generated by the brain to indicate that a boundary has been crossed, a value has been violated, or a need has gone unmet. However, when people are taught, either directly or indirectly, that expressing anger is unacceptable, disrespectful, or dangerous, they learn to suppress it. Over time, this suppression doesn't just impact emotional well-being. It alters the functional strength of the prefrontal cortex, the very region of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, emotional regulation, and long-term planning. The prefrontal cortex acts like the CEO of the brain. It integrates information from the limbic system, where raw emotional data like fear, anger, and desire are processed, and determines an appropriate response based on logic, context, and values. But when a person habitually suppresses anger, especially in an attempt to remain nice, agreeable, or likable, the prefrontal cortex has to override powerful limbic signals repeatedly. This constant emotional braking is mentally exhausting and depletes executive function capacity over time. Suppression is not the same as regulation. Regulation means processing and expressing emotions in a healthy way, acknowledging the emotion, understanding its source, and channeling it constructively. Suppression, on the other hand, is an unconscious avoidance mechanism. It forces the brain to bottle up activation from the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, which leads to internal friction. This conflict between the emotional and rational brain creates what is known as cognitive dissonance, and the longer it continues, the more strain it places on neural resources. Neuroimaging studies have shown that people who regularly suppress negative emotions, like anger, exhibit decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and increased activity in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, which are regions associated with stress, error detection, and emotional conflict. In other words, the more someone suppresses their authentic emotional responses, the more their brain starts to operate in a state of internal alarm, even if everything looks calm on the outside. Chronic suppression also affects working memory, attention span, and resilience. The prefrontal cortex becomes overtaxed from constantly managing unspoken emotions, making it harder to focus, make decisions, or respond flexibly to stress. This leads to emotional numbness, confusion, and burnout. People begin to feel like they are going through the motions, disconnected from their own needs and unaware of what they actually feel. They lose the neural sensitivity to detect their own boundaries until they are crossed too far, often resulting in sudden emotional outbursts, withdrawal, or passive-aggressive behavior. Suppressing anger also affects bodily systems. Emotion is not just in the mind, it's embodied. When the nervous system is triggered, but not allowed to complete the response, such as expressing displeasure or asserting oneself, that energy is stored in the body. Over time, this unexpressed anger leads to muscular tension, headaches, digestive issues, and elevated cortisol levels. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenals HPA axis, which governs the body's stress response, becomes dysregulated. This means that even small stressors can trigger exaggerated physiological reactions, making the person feel overwhelmed or anxious with no clear reason. Moreover, suppression disconnects a person from their sense of agency. Anger, in its healthy form, is an empowering emotion. It signals injustice and mobilizes action. It gives people the drive to speak up, set limits, and protect their energy. When someone has learned to constantly override this signal in the name of niceness, their brain learns to interpret assertiveness as danger. They start to associate speaking up with shame or fear, and over time, the neural circuits related to assertive communication weaken through lack of use. This weakening is compounded by social reinforcement. Society often rewards people, especially in certain roles or cultural contexts, for being agreeable, accommodating, and easy to work with. But those rewards come at the expense of internal coherence. Each time anger is swallowed instead of processed, the brain stores that event as a time when safety required self-abandonment. Multiply this by years, and what you get is a person who is externally polite, but internally fragmented. A person whose prefrontal cortex is constantly hijacked by emotional energy. It's trying to suppress rather than channel productively. If this creates a chronic internal imbalance between the need for emotional authenticity and the learned habit of emotional avoidance. The brain's architecture begins to reflect this imbalance, showing decreased integration between emotional and cognitive regions, which ultimately weakens the very circuits that make clear thinking and healthy boundaries possible. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls that push people away. In truth, they are the framework that defines who we are, our values, needs, priorities, and limitations. Neuroscience reveals that boundary setting is not just a psychological skill, It is a process that engages specific brain networks related to self-identity, emotional regulation, and autonomy. When you say no, especially when it feels uncomfortable, you are activating and strengthening the neural circuits responsible for self-awareness and individual agency. One of the most critical systems involved in this process is the default mode network, DMN. The default mode network is a set of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and inferior parietal lobule, that becomes active when you are engaged in introspection, reflecting on yourself, imagining your future, or recalling autobiographical experiences. This network is deeply involved in maintaining your sense of who you are over time. When you reflect on what you stand for, where your limits are, and how you expect to be treated, you are engaging the DMN. Each time you assert a boundary, you reinforce those internal maps that tell you this is me, this is not me, this is okay, this is not okay. From a neurological standpoint, boundaries are not rigid. They are adaptive behaviors supported by the integration of emotional and cognitive systems. When you enforce a boundary, multiple brain regions work together. The anterior cingulate cortex helps detect conflict, such as when someone's behavior violates your limits. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex processes values and emotional consequences. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex helps you evaluate the risk of asserting yourself and enables the regulation of your tone and delivery. When these regions are used consistently in boundary setting, they become more efficient, allowing you to respond more clearly and confidently over time. The act of setting a boundary also generates a neurochemical response that supports personal growth and stability. When you assert your needs or say no in a way that aligns with your values, the brain often releases acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter linked to focus, clarity, and reinforcement learning. This chemical response helps encode the experience as successful, which encourages the brain to repeat it in future situations. Over time, this strengthens your sense of self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle challenges and advocate for yourself effectively. There's also a structural component to consider. Neural pathways strengthen through a process called long-term potentiation, ALTP, which means that repeated use of a circuit makes it faster and more automatic. If you regularly ignore your boundaries, you strengthen circuits related to self-abandonment, fawning, and passivity. But if you repeatedly uphold your limits, even in small ways, you strengthen circuits of self-respect, assertiveness, and identity coherence. These changes aren't just metaphorical. They're observable in functional brain scans and behavioral outcomes. Psychologically, setting boundaries also helps shift your orientation from external focus to internal clarity. People who struggle with chronic niceness are often externally referenced. They base their actions on how others feel, what others expect, or what will keep the peace. But when you begin to set boundaries, you recenter your attention inward. You start to ask, what matters to me? What am I feeling right now? What do I need in this moment? These questions activate introspective networks in the brain, especially in the medial prefrontal cortex, which governs personal meaning making. The emotional regulation that comes with boundary setting also has physiological benefits. By reducing the stress associated with people pleasing or overextending yourself, you lower chronic cortisol levels, which protects the hippocampus, a key area for memory and learning. Boundaries, therefore, don't just protect your time and energy, they protect your cognitive clarity and emotional resilience. There's also a social feedback loop involved. When you uphold boundaries, others begin to treat you accordingly. The human brain is a social organ, and we're constantly scanning each other for cues about what is acceptable. If your behavior signals that you don't tolerate disrespect or emotional manipulation, people are more likely to respect those boundaries. This reduces the cognitive load on your system because you're no longer expending mental energy managing chaotic or draining interactions. Your brain becomes free to focus on more meaningful, goal-directed behavior. This shift in how others interact with you further reinforces the neural circuits of self-identity. You begin to perceive yourself as someone who is not only aware of their worth, but capable of protecting it. Even when it requires temporary discomfort or social friction, respect is a neurological and psychological response to consistency, confidence, and clarity. It is not earned through politeness alone, but through congruence between words, actions, and principles. When someone is constantly nice at the expense of their own truth, agreeing with everyone, avoiding discomfort, saying yes to things they dislike, they begin to lose the very qualities that generate respect. From a neuroscience perspective, this happens because of the way the human brain evaluates predictability, emotional safety, and social hierarchy through subtle cues, many of which operate below conscious awareness. The brain is always scanning for reliability in others. This is a deeply wired evolutionary function that allows us to determine who we can trust, who holds authority, and who is safe to follow or cooperate with. People who are overly nice, those who rarely say no, never challenge anything, and constantly prioritize others, may initially seem warm and likable. But over time, their behavior begins to trigger uncertainty in the brains of others. The question becomes, what does this person really think? What do they actually stand for? That uncertainty undermines respect, even when it's unspoken. From a social neuroscience standpoint, the prefrontal cortex evaluates social dynamics by interpreting nonverbal signals, posture, voice tone, facial expression, as well as behavioral consistency. When someone lacks standards and shifts their response based on what others want to hear, the brain of the observer senses incongruence. This activates regions like the anterior insula, which processes discomfort, and the temporoparietal junction, which helps us assess the intentions and reliability of others. The result is a subtle but real drop in perceived credibility and authority. Being perpetually nice without boundaries also sends the message that your time, energy, and preferences are secondary. This teaches people through repetition to deprioritize your needs. Not necessarily because they're malicious, but because human relationships operate on implicit learning. If every time you're asked for a favor, you say yes, even when it inconveniences you, your behavior trains others to expect it. The mirror neuron system, which allows us to read and reflect others' emotions, picks up on the subtle cues of self-erasure, and the subconscious conclusion becomes, this person doesn't value themselves that much, so maybe I don't need to either. Respect, like trust, is built through healthy tension. It arises not from constant agreement, but from the courage to hold your position, express differing opinions, and enforce your values, even when it risks conflict. When you eliminate that tension by defaulting to appeasement, you also eliminate the conditions that allow respect to emerge. This is why people who are firm, even blunt, often earn more respect than those who are endlessly agreeable. The brain equates clarity with safety. Someone who clearly communicates their limits and follows through is more neurologically reassuring than someone who is ambiguous or overly accommodating. On a deeper level, people who lack internal standards also experience a decline in self-respect. Every time you override your instincts or values just to be liked, your brain registers that moment as a micro-betrayal. The default mode network, responsible for self-reflection and identity, becomes conflicted. You begin to experience inner tension, confusion, or even resentment, not because others are mistreating you, but because you are repeatedly sending the signal to your own nervous system that your needs don't matter. Over time, this weakens the neural circuits of self-advocacy and reinforces learned helplessness or passivity. Furthermore, when niceness becomes habitual rather than intentional, it loses authenticity. Authenticity is one of the core traits humans use to evaluate trustworthiness. When someone says what they mean and means what they say, their words and energy align, and this coherence registers in the brain as believable. But when someone smiles while feeling resentful, agrees while feeling resistance, or supports something they internally oppose, the limbic system of the observer picks up on the mismatch. This cognitive dissonance leads to mistrust, even if the person appears friendly on the surface. This entire pattern also impacts your social hierarchy positioning, especially in professional environments. Leadership, influence, and authority are not granted to those who are simply agreeable. They are given to those who are respected, and respect is a result of demonstrated integrity and psychological strength. When someone lacks standards, when they let others cross lines, shift priorities endlessly, or violate agreements without consequence, they begin to project instability. The human brain, which is highly attuned to dominance cues, starts to place them lower in the unconscious social order. In essence, being nice without having any internal standards, boundaries, or self-protective mechanisms sends a confusing signal to others that you're there to serve, not to lead, to accommodate, not to assert, to blend in, not to stand out. And while that might bring temporary comfort or approval, the long-term consequence is a loss of presence, voice, and ultimately respect. The human nervous system is not designed for chronic submission or constant appeasement. It is built for adaptive regulation, healthy stress, and assertive engagement with the world. Neuroscience reveals that assertiveness is not simply a learned behavior. It is a biologically supported function of a well-regulated mind and body. Appeasement, in contrast, is a short-term survival strategy that may arise under conditions of chronic stress, trauma, or social conditioning. While it may feel safer in the moment, long-term appeasement comes at a cost: suppressed identity, emotional disconnection, and a diminished sense of agency. At the core of assertiveness lies the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic system allows you to mobilize, to take action, to speak up, to defend your values. The parasympathetic system, when healthy, brings calm and composure. When you are assertive, both systems work in harmony. You express what needs to be said with clarity, but without aggression. This state is known as regulated assertiveness, and it reflects optimal nervous system functioning. It is not impulsive or reactive. It is deliberate, grounded, and confident. From a neurochemical perspective, assertiveness is supported by a cocktail of brain chemicals that enhance cognitive control and emotional clarity. Acetylcholine helps with focus and accurate communication. Serotonin contributes to confidence, mood stability, and social status regulation. Dopamine, when released in balanced amounts, drives motivation and the pursuit of goals. These chemicals are not activated through self-erasure or passive compliance. They are stimulated when you move toward purposeful action, when you make decisions that align with your core values and speak your truth even when it's uncomfortable. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventromedial and dorsolateral regions, plays a critical role in assertive behavior. These areas are involved in evaluating emotional data, planning responses, and controlling impulses. When you're assertive, this part of the brain is active and online. But in states of chronic appeasement or fear-based niceness, the prefrontal cortex gets hijacked by limbic system activity, especially the amygdala, which is hyper, focused on threat detection. This switch leads to defaulting into fawn or freeze responses. The brain moves from "how do I want to handle this?" to "how do I survive this?" In developmental neuroscience, assertiveness is linked to secure attachment and emotional attunement. Children raised in environments where their voice was respected and their boundaries were honored tend to grow into adults who can express themselves without guilt. They learn early on that disagreement does not equal danger, and that standing up for themselves does not jeopardize love or safety. But those raised in volatile or emotionally unpredictable environments may develop neural associations between assertiveness and threat. Their nervous system codes confrontation, even healthy confrontation, as dangerous, prompting a learned strategy of appeasement to avoid conflict. However, because assertiveness is a natural biological state, not an artificial construct, it can be reclaimed through intentional practice. The neural circuits that support assertive behavior never disappear. They simply become underutilized. Through repetition, challenge, and exposure to regulated discomfort, these pathways can be reactivated. Each time you express a boundary, voice an honest opinion, or advocate for yourself, you are retraining your brain and body to feel safe in strength. This is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on new experiences. The vagus nerve, a key component of the parasympathetic system, also plays a role in assertiveness. When functioning optimally, it supports a calm, steady physiological state even during moments of stress or confrontation. This allows you to remain firm without becoming aggressive and compassionate without becoming submissive. Activating this system through breath work, grounding, and self-awareness practices can enhance your ability to stay present and self-assured in difficult conversations or high-stakes environments. Assertiveness also influences body language, tone, and nonverbal communication, all of which are decoded rapidly by others. The mirror neuron system in the brain allows people to pick up on your confidence, congruence, and composure. When you speak with aligned posture, calm energy, and a clear voice, others instinctively perceive you as competent and trustworthy. These impressions are not just social, they are neurological, and they shape how others respond to you. When you operate from a place of chronic appeasement, you send signals of instability, hesitation, and fear, even if your words are polite. The nervous system of the listener detects these signals and adjusts accordingly. They may dismiss your opinion, question your boundaries, or fail to take your voice seriously, not necessarily because they intend to be disrespectful, but because your presentation communicates uncertainty, Assertiveness corrects this. It reestablishes internal alignment, which creates external coherence, leading to stronger relationships, better decision making, and deeper self-trust. Ultimately, assertiveness is a biological expression of self-regulation, purpose, and internal safety. It's not about domination. It's about self-ownership. And it represents a nervous system